Hey guys, welcome back to more Reddit revenge stories. In this Ripestories video, my boss fired me while I was on vacation because I would not go out with him. But here's what he didn't count on. I had spent 4 years watching him steal millions from workers who were too afraid to speak up. So I made one phone call that would change everything. Let's dive right into the video. And the amazing XXL title story is called "Boss Fired Me During Vacation, so I got him investigated by the federal government." So I worked at a consulting firm for almost 4 years, about 80 employees, mostly in the corporate office with a handful of remote workers scattered around. The company did IT consulting and staffing, basically placing tech workers at client sites and handling project management for companies that did not want to build their own IT departments. It was decent work, not glamorous but steady, and I was good at it. I started as a junior HR coordinator right out of college and over time worked my way into a role that was basically a hybrid of HR operations and compliance. I handled onboarding, maintained employee files, managed benefits paperwork, processed worker authorization documents, and kept track of visa sponsorship timelines, basically anything that involved keeping the people side of the business running smoothly. I was not just pushing papers either, because I had built most of the filing systems from scratch because when I started the place was an absolute mess. Personal files were incomplete, I-9 forms were missing or filled out wrong, and there was no centralized tracking for visa expiration dates. I spent my first year basically rebuilding the entire HR documentation infrastructure, and I took a lot of pride in that. The owner of the company was this older guy who had started the business in the 90s and was slowly stepping back from daily operations. He was fine, not great but not terrible, and he mostly left me alone to do my job, which was all I really wanted. The problem started when he brought in a new operations director to essentially run the day-to-day. This was gonna be my new direct boss. Let's call him Rick. Rick was maybe mid-40s, divorced, and drove a car that showed he had a small cucumber down there and a massive ego, and had this energy like he thought he was the smartest and most charming person in every room. He was not either of those things, by the way. He had come from a larger staffing company where he had apparently been some kind of regional manager, but I later found out that he had been encouraged to resign from that position. Should have been a red flag for the owner, but Rick was good at interviews, I guess. From the very first week, Rick made me uncomfortable. Nothing I could point to initially, just a vibe. And by the way guys, just for some clarification, I think OP in this story is female. Anyway, he would stand a little too close when we were talking, and he would find reasons to come by my desk even though his office was on the other side of the building, and he would make comments about my appearance that he would frame as compliments, like, "You look really nice today," is fine once. But when your boss says it every single morning while looking you up and down, it starts to feel different. About a month in, Rick asked me to grab lunch to discuss the department restructuring. I figured it was a work thing, so I agreed. We went to a restaurant near the office, and within about 10 minutes it was clear this was not about restructuring anything. He started asking me personal questions. Was I seeing anyone? What did I do on weekends? Did I like wine? Because he knew this great wine bar downtown. I kept steering the conversation back to work stuff, and he kept steering it back to personal territory. At the end of lunch, he said something I will never forget. He leaned across the table and said, "You know, I think people who work closely together and have a connection shouldn't fight it. It only makes the work relationship harder." I told him I appreciated the lunch, but I like to keep work and personal life separate. He smiled and said, "We will see." We will see. Like my boundary was a negotiation, he was gonna win eventually through persistence. Like he just needed to wear me down. That attitude told me everything I needed to know about Rick as a person. The worst part was that other people in the office could see what was happening, but nobody said anything. One of the other admins gave me this sympathetic look once Rick was hovering over my desk for the third time in an hour talking about nothing. After he left, she mouthed, "I'm sorry," at me, and that's it. Nobody was gonna rock the boat because Rick had the owner's full backing, and everyone knew it. Over the next few months, Rick kept pushing. He would message me after hours about non-work stuff, and he would suggest we take client dinners together, even when there was no reason for me to be there. He once told me point blank that women in our industry move up faster when they have someone powerful advocating for them, and that he could be that advocate for me if we were closer. I told him no multiple times. Each time I said no, it was polite and professional because I needed this job. I was still paying off student loans and I just signed a lease on a new apartment. I could not afford to quit, and I also didn't want to because I loved the actual work I was doing. Every time I turned Rick down, things got a little colder between us professionally. Tasks I used to handle independently suddenly required his approval. He started CCing himself on all my emails. He would question my work in front of other people for no reason. Once I sent out a benefits enrollment reminder that was identical to the one I'd sent the previous 2 years, and he called me into his office to tell me the tone was unprofessional and that I needed to run communications through him going forward. I knew what was happening here. This was retaliation, textbook stuff, but I did not report it because honestly, I didn't trust that it would go anywhere. The owner was barely around anymore, and Rick was his golden boy who could do no wrong. There was no real HR department to report to because, well, I basically was the HR department. The irony is not lost on me. I just kept my head down and did my work. I documented everything though, every weird comment, every after-hours message, every time he treated me differently after I had turned down his advances. I kept screenshots and I kept a journal with dates and descriptions. Call it professional instinct. When you work in HR, you learn that documentation is everything. Now, here's where I need to explain something about what I saw during my time handling the company's employee documentation, because this becomes very important later. As I mentioned, a big part of our business was placing IT consultants at client sites, and a lot of these consultants were on H-1B visas. The company sponsored their visas, handled the legal filings, and was supposed to pay them the prevailing wage that was listed on their labor condition applications. For anyone who doesn't know, when a company sponsors an H-1B worker, they have to file paperwork with the Department of Labor stating what they will pay that worker, and that amount has to meet or exceed the prevailing wage for that job in that area. This is not optional, it is federal law. I processed the payroll documentation and I maintained the personnel files. I saw the LCA filings and I saw the actual paychecks, and the numbers did not match. On paper, according to the LCAs filed with the government, our H-1B employees were being paid between $85,000 and $110,000 depending on their role and location, but in reality, based on their payroll records I handled, many of them were being paid between $55,000 and $70,000. The difference was significant and it was not accidental. I first noticed the discrepancy about 2 years into my time there, well before Rick even showed up. I brought it to the owner's attention and he gave me this dismissive wave and told me the salary figures were structured differently because of housing allowances and other benefits that supposedly made up the gap. That explanation did not sit right with me, but I was young back then and new to the workforce, and he was the owner, so I let it go. When Rick came on board and took over operations, the wage gap actually got worse. New H-1B hires were coming in at even lower actual salaries, while the LCA filings showed higher and higher prevailing wages. The gap between what was reported to the government and what was actually paid was growing. I also noticed that the company was billing clients the full rate for these consultants, sometimes $150 an hour or even more, while paying the workers a fraction of what was reported on their visa applications. The money was going somewhere, and it was not to the employees. I kept quiet about it at first. I know that might sound bad, but you have to understand my position. I was already being retaliated against for turning down my boss. If I started making noise about potential federal violations, I would be out of the door before I could even finish the sentence, and the H-1B workers themselves were not gonna complain because their immigration status was tied to their employment. If they got fired, their visa would be revoked and they would have to leave the country. The company knew this and used it as leverage. I once overheard Rick on the phone telling a consultant who had asked about his salary that he should be grateful for the opportunity and that there are plenty of people back home who would love to be in your position. That made my stomach turn, so I sat on this knowledge. Not forever, just until the right moment. I didn't know when that moment would be, but I had a feeling that Rick would eventually give me a reason. He gave me that reason during my vacation. I had booked a trip months in advance, 10 days off, the first real vacation I'd taken in over a year. I had the time approved in writing, my coverage was arranged and everything was by the book. I flew out on a Saturday and by Monday I was sitting on a beach trying to decompress from months of workplace stress, and on Tuesday afternoon I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer the call, but something made me pick it up. It was one of the other office admins. She was practically whispering. She told me Rick had called an all-hands meeting that morning and announced that my position was being eliminated due to restructuring and that my employment was terminated effective immediately. He had already someone boxing up my desk. I sat there on this beach chair, just staring at the ocean, trying to process what she was telling me. She said Rick had told the staff that my performance had been declining for months and that the decision had been made at the executive level, and she said a few people pushed back and asked questions and Rick shut them down immediately. She also said Rick seemed almost giddy about the whole thing, like he was enjoying himself. She told me one of the consultants who had helped navigate his visa renewal process had asked what happened to her. She was really good at her job. And Rick had apparently responded with something like, "People are not always what they seem." That comment made my blood boil more than the actual firing. She told me my final paycheck and Cobra information would be mailed to my home address. I just went quiet for a while. I mean, my trip was ruined, obviously. I couldn't enjoy anything after that. I spent the rest of those days in my hotel room thinking, here's the thing about being fired while you're on vacation for performance issues that don't even exist. It is so transparently retaliatory that it almost feels like an insult to your intelligence. Rick didn't even try to build a real case. There were no write-ups in my file because I'd never been written up. There were no performance improvement plans because my performance was excellent and I had the reviews to prove it. He just fired me while I was gone, so he would not have to look at me when he did it. But here's the other thing, Rick had just fired the one person in the company who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, and when I got home, I did not go on a rampage straight away. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and I thought very carefully about what I was gonna do. I thought about it for a couple days because I wanted to make sure I was being strategic and not just emotional. My first instinct was honestly to just move on, get a new job, forget about Rick, forget about the company, and part of me just wanted to disappear and start over because confrontation has never been my strength. But every time I started browsing job listings, I would think about those H-1B workers who were being paid tens of thousands less than what the government was told they earned, people who couldn't speak up because their entire life in this country depended on keeping their employer happy. People that Rick was exploiting because he knew they had no leverage, and then I would think about Rick sitting in his office with that smug look on his face, probably already telling the new hire some version of why the previous person did not work out. No, moving on was not gonna be enough. Then I started making phone calls, and my first call was to an employment attorney. I explained the situation, the harassment, the retaliation, and the firing during vacation. She told me I had a strong case for wrongful termination and we could pursue that, but there was more, and I explained what I knew about the H-1B wage situation. She went quiet for a moment and then said I needed to contact the Department of Labor. So I did. I filed a complaint with the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division and I laid out everything I knew. The discrepancies between the LCA filings and the actual wages paid, the approximate number of affected workers, and of course the time frame. I did not have the actual documents anymore since I obviously couldn't access company files after being fired, but I had enough specific details from 4 years of handling this paperwork that I could point investigators in exactly the right direction. Furthermore, my attorney also helped me figure out where to report the immigration side of things. I'm not going to pretend I understood the full bureaucracy of it because there were a lot more forms and a lot of phone calls to different offices. But the bottom line was that what this company was doing was not just a wage issue. Filing false info on visa applications is federal fraud, and there are agencies that take that very seriously. After I filed those reports, I went back to focusing on the wrongful termination and harassment side of things with my attorney. She started the legal process on that front, which I won't go into detail about. That process takes time, so I settled in and waited, and a few weeks went by, then a few more. I was collecting unemployment, which Rick had tried to contest by claiming I was terminated for cause, but since there was zero documentation supporting that claim, it was ruled in my favor. That small victory felt pretty good, but it was nothing compared to what came next. A while after I filed my complaints, a former co-worker texted me. She said 2 people in suits, federal agents I assume, had shown up at the office with a lot of paperwork and had been in the conference room with Rick and the owner for most of the day. She said they left with boxes of files, and she also said Rick had been visibly rattled for the rest of the week, snapping at everyone and staying in his office with the door closed. Apparently, the swagger was gone. She said that he looked like a completely different person. I didn't say anything to her about what I had done, I just said interesting and left it at that, and then another former coworker reached out. This one told me that several of the H-1B consultants had been contacted individually and asked to provide their pay stubs and employment contracts, and she said the mood in the office had completely shifted. People were nervous, people were updating their resumes. Rick had apparently tried to hold a company meeting to reassure everyone that it was just a routine audit, but nobody believed him because routine audits don't involve investigators leaving with boxes of your files. And then another. Over the next few weeks, the picture became even more clear. The Department of Labor had opened a full investigation. They were pulling payroll records, visa filings, tax documents, and employment contracts. They were also interviewing current and former H-1B employees, many of whom were apparently very forthcoming. Once they understood that they were victims in the situation and not targets, I did get a call from someone at the DOL a few weeks in asking me to clarify some details from my original complaint. It was a pretty short conversation, honestly, and they asked about specific dates and file locations, and I told them what I could remember. They seemed to already have a good handle on what they were looking for and were building the case from the company's own records at that point, separately from the federal investigation, and my employment attorney was also going after the company for the harassment and wrongful termination. I'm gonna be vague about the exact legal process because my attorney told me not to share too many specifics online, but basically once the company's lawyers realized they were also dealing with a federal investigation on top of my claims, they became very motivated to settle quickly. I think they wanted to make at least one of their problems go away. The company hired an attorney who tried the usual defense. They claimed my termination was part of a legitimate restructuring. When my lawyer pointed out that no other positions were eliminated and someone was hired to do essentially my exact job 3 weeks after I was fired, that defense fell apart pretty quickly. They tried to claim that I had performance issues, and my lawyer produced my last 3 performance reviews, all rated exceeds expectations or higher. They had absolutely nothing. We settled, and I'm not gonna state the exact amount, but I'll say it was enough to cover my legal fees, pay off my remaining student loans, and give me a very comfortable cushion while I looked for new work. But the settlement was the small potatoes. The federal investigation was the main course. The company was hit with citations for willful violations of H-1B program requirements, and the wage theft was even worse than I'd suspected. Investigators found that over a 5-year period, the company had underpaid H-1B workers by a cumulative total of over $2 million. The difference between what was reported to the government on the visa paperwork and what was actually paid to workers was substantial and systematic. It was not just a paperwork error, it was a scheme, but it didn't stop there. When the DOL investigators dug into financial records, they also found evidence of tax irregularities. The company had been classifying some of the wage differences as consulting fees paid to a separate LLC that, surprise surprise, was controlled by Rick. He had literally been pocketing the difference between what the government was told workers earned and what they actually received, running it through a shell company and not properly reporting it. Rick got hit with a bunch of federal charges. I don't know all the legal terminology, but it covered the visa stuff, the wage theft, and the tax situation with his shell company. The owner was also implicated for his role in establishing the original scheme before Rick came along and made it even worse. The company was hit with massive penalties from the DOL and was basically banned from sponsoring any more foreign workers. For a company whose business model depended heavily on placing H-1B consultants at client sites, this was essentially a death sentence. Clients started pulling their contract once word got out about the investigation. Nobody wanted to be associated with a company under federal investigation for immigration fraud. For all of this fraud, the company ended up shutting down and closed its doors completely. 80 people lost their jobs, which I do feel bad about, but honestly, the company was built on exploitation and it was only a matter of time before it collapsed one way or another. The employees who were being exploited on fraudulent visas were connected with legal resources to adjust their immigration status, and Rick legal dealings were severe. I'm not gonna go into details of the proceedings because honestly I only know what was reported publicly and through the people I stayed in touch with. What I do know is that he was convicted on multiple counts and received a prison sentence. I don't know the exact length and I'm not gonna speculate. The owner took a plea deal for a reduced sentence and cooperation. As for me, I found a new job thankfully, better company, better pay, better leadership, and a boss who has never once commented on my appearance or suggested my career would benefit from dating him. I'm doing great. But I want to be clear about something. When Rick fired me, I did not set out to destroy the company, I set out to hold him accountable. But when you spend years committing federal crimes and then you fire the one person who witnessed all of it and you do it in the most brazen and retaliatory way possible, you really shouldn't be surprised when those crimes come to light. I did not ruin Rick's life, Rick ruined Rick's life, I just made sure the right people heard about it. And the next one is a super satisfying malicious compliance story that you don't want to miss. It is titled, "Won't Be Taught by a Girl, So He Got Fired." So for some context, I used to work for my grandparents on an oil farm in Texas. I was 17, freshly graduated from high school, and had moved from the Midwest to Texas to live with my grandparents and work on the oil farm they worked for, doing some easy data entry. The building was essentially a tin building on the job site where my grandma and I, the only two office workers besides my grandfather, who was the foreman, worked. Basically, when the new hires would come in that had missed the initial hiring round, I was the one that would make sure all their paperwork was in order and they had all their OSHA classes finished, and if any safety training hadn't been done, I would just put in the VHS and confirm on a written copy that they had finished it under my instruction. This went on for 2 months with no issue until one fateful day, a regular Florida man, record and all, came in as a new hire and came to my office to finish his new hire paperwork. Once he was in my office, I found out he had no safety training to speak of, and I informed him his next day or two would be spent in my office watching safety videos. All of this was paid, of course. He immediately flew into a rage, screaming about how he would not have some little girl teaching him how to do his job. Which again, I was a 17-year-old female and was only going through company standards and OSHA rules with him. I went to my grandpa, who was my boss at the time, obviously very confused and uncomfortable and unsure of how I should proceed. To which my grandpa said, "You want to fire him?" Cue my excitement, and grandfather follows me to my office and I, as a 17-year-old, get to fire this grown-ass man sitting in front of me. I start directing him to gather his things and leave, and he starts up a huge fit, yelling and cursing at me before he noticed my grandpa standing in the door with his gun holstered on his hip. My grandpa usually kept this locked in a safe on the ground or in his truck, and I hadn't realized until after he had pulled it out just for me, and very quietly then he got up and left. That was the most satisfying moment of my life. And the next one is a satisfying petty revenge story, which is titled, "Try to Make Me Look Bad in Front of the Boss? You Should Have Read First." So I just had a bit of a petty triumph at work and wanted to share the joy. So for my job, we look at educational programs completed in foreign countries and write reports about how they compare to ones in our country. A coworker tried to say that I had done a report wrong, but if she read the program requirements, she would have seen that I was actually right because the person only completed 10 years of school before their program, not the 12 years required by our credential. My revenge? I said nothing and let her bring our boss into it. Instead of making me look bad, she made herself look stupid, and the boss asked her why she was trying to watch my work instead of doing her work. And yeah guys, there's a famous saying that goes, "Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake." Thank you for watching, I will see you again tomorrow.